Our next guest is Dr. Thomas Reid. Dr. Reid is a reader in the War Studies at King's College London. He worked at the School for Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, the RAND Corporation, and at the Institut Français de Relations Internationales à Paris. Reid holds a PhD from the Humboldt University in Berlin. Dr. Reid published 4 books and numerous articles that appeared in major journals, magazines, and newspapers. Thomas Reid has commented on current affairs on the BBC, CNN, Sky, Al Jazeera, and others. Dr. Reid, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak after Richard Clarke, my first time, and rather exciting. Because of my book, if you're buying my book on Amazon, you get the recommendation to buy Richard Clarke's book at the same time. So it's a nice contrast here. Cyber war versus cyber war will not take place. I will not speak about the attribution problem in detail today, because when I accepted the invitation today, I didn't know that I would be speaking in front of such a large audience, and the attribution problem can be rather technical and geeky. So I will zoom out but touch on the attribution problem. But I think it's a nice discussion we will be having in the next few minutes, because the notion of cyber weapons is indeed a useful one, but my take on it would be slightly different than Richard Clarke's. Just a brief backup, we know this is how the cyber security debate looks like in the popular media. It has somewhat improved over the past couple of months, but not by very much. It's rather shrill, and I think that's part of the problem. Let's not spend time on those covers and on the popular debate and focus on the more interesting argument. I work in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and my head of department, after I got hired about 2 years ago, used to introduce me as, "Oh, this is Thomas Reid, he's our cyber war expert." And I always cringed when he said that, because I don't think there is such a thing as a cyber war expert in the first place, and certainly that's not me. Well, you have to understand that my colleague next door would be working on the Somme, or say on the Second World War. And cyber war, after all, has never resulted, and a cyber attack has never resulted in a single physical injury, let alone a fatality. Usually it is something else. The only cyber attack that has resulted in significant physical damage was Stuxnet. And I will briefly argue today that by focusing on Stuxnet, we are really making it more difficult to talk about the proper solutions. So let's get war out of the way very quickly. If we are talking about war and we are not using a metaphor, as in the war on cancer, the war on drugs, etc., then we are talking about acts that are violent, or at least potentially violent. Really, if it can't kill you, it's not really an act of war. And we are talking about acts that are instrumental. I'm doing this to you in order to change your behavior in a certain way. And we're also talking about acts that are political, in the sense that I'm taking credit for it and say, I did this to you because I want you to change your behavior. If you walk all cyber attacks, computer network attacks, breaches, etc., that we know through those 3 criteria, you have very few that meet even only one of them. And I think I would argue none that meets all of them. So if it's not war, what is it then? I think if we talk about war in this context, and really also about weapons, we are focusing our mind on 2 things. One, the military should be in charge, or at least military organizations related to the military. And secondly, we're focusing our mind on violence. And suddenly you have all these science fiction scenarios of very bad things happening to planes falling from the sky, etc. I'm not saying it's entirely impossible, but it's rather unlikely this is happening anytime soon. Instead, what we're seeing is sabotage operations. Sabotage means you do a computer attack in order to make a machine stop or damage the machine, as Stuxnet did. But you can be more abstract and say damage a process, withdraw efficiency from a process. Can be a bureaucratic process as well. But it has to be immediate, not over a decade. So that's sabotage. Second is, and sabotage attacks, again, are the exception. It depends on what you count, but if we actually look at control system, industrial control system attacks, and you look at all the data that we have, all the case studies we have, I think we can probably agree on 3 to 5 attacks that were actually successful and made a difference. Stuxnet being the most important one. I'm walking through all of these in great detail in the book, by the way. So it's a tiny number. And in that context, I think it makes sense, in the context of sabotage, to speak about cyber weapons or cyber arms that could be controlled, as again like Stuxnet. But the second activity that I'd like to mention very briefly, espionage or intelligence operations, intelligence agencies don't like to use that term, espionage, if they're talking about themselves, only when they talk about others. The espionage is a major problem. Of course, that's not controversial to say. Economic espionage, commercial espionage, intellectual property theft, but of course also political espionage. Now here, I'd like to respond directly to Richard Clarke's, I thought, very stimulating presentation. Would we call this, the microphone I'm speaking into, a weapon? I would say a microphone is not a weapon. So a vulnerability that allows an attacker to take control, or not control, but to listen into your smartphone, into your Android device, for instance. Is that really a weapon? And when does code turn into a weapon? I would say it turns into a weapon only if it has the potential to actually create a sabotage impact. And in the Cold War, nobody tried to ban espionage. And indeed, even today, it would be rather unrealistic to assume that Western states and Western nations would limit their espionage intelligence operations in this arena significantly. But the big point here is, in that context, I think it doesn't make too much sense to speak about arms control, because again, information that is used to exfiltrate information only is probably not a weapon, only once you start influencing a process. And then there's hacktivism and subversion, which I will not talk about today in detail. But the key argument that I'd like to highlight here, if we look at all 3 activities here, and some of you will now think, what about crime? Yes, of course, crime is a major issue, but we're talking politics today, so I'll leave out the criminal problem here just for completeness. I want to mention this. If we look at all 3 areas, what we are seeing is, in fact, not more violence, not more cyber war and acts of war and weapons and whatnot. We're seeing less violence. Today, it is possible to sabotage an air defense system and blind the air defense system, as Israel allegedly did in 2007 in Syria, through computer attack. You don't have to kill the operators or possibly injure the operators of that air defense system. You can do that by code, by a computer attack only. It's rather difficult to do, that's why it's so rare, but in theory it's possible. So there's no violence in some acts of sabotage at all. This is a new distinction today. It's cleaner than in the past. Same in espionage. It's possible to exfiltrate information without infiltrating operatives first, from a distance. So the personal risk involved in computer espionage arguably is much lower than the personal risk that you need, that people took in order to dig the Berlin Tunnel or to bug an embassy in the Cold War. So there's also a new, less, if you like, physical, less violent dynamic at place. And thirdly, the same applies to subversion, but again, I'm not going into detail here because I'm very limited in time. It also applies to crime, by the way. If you look at crime statistics, we're in the middle of an economic slump. In the UK, crime statistics were released not too long ago, and it happens to, quite surprisingly, in this economic climate, that crime, almost all forms of crime, street crime, are down, except, of course, computer crime is up. So the same dynamic may apply as well in that field. I'd like to speak briefly about weaponized code, or cyber weapons, if you like, that could be possibly limited. And the only example that we have so far is Stuxnet. There's nothing like Stuxnet. So anybody who gives presentations saying attacks like Stuxnet, be skeptical, because there is no such attack that is like Stuxnet right now. Not even Flame and Gauss and some espionage operations that may have used code that was used in Stuxnet come even close, because they don't have a highly bespoke payload that was developed for an ICS system that was highly specified. So if you look at Stuxnet, I think we have to see one rather unpleasant fact, unpleasant for those who may have been involved in the operation itself. Why? Because it failed. It failed, and I'll give you 5 reasons. First, let me make clear, I think it was a good idea to try it out. Right? I'm not saying it was a bad idea, but it failed. It's a very important thing to be able to recognize. First, I think it failed 5 reasons. It failed because it was a psychological operation primarily. The idea was to mess with, not just with the equipment of Iranian engineers, but with their minds. If you think, I'm the problem, I can't get this to work, then it's very hard to fix the problem because you are the problem. But if you know that somebody else is doing this to you, then of course you can isolate the problem and move on. But by the time Stuxnet was found as a software, as an attack code, that had happened. And it didn't matter, they didn't have to know who did it to them, they only needed to know that somebody else did it to them. So then, secondly, the kinetic element also arguably failed. The sabotage dimension also failed, because if we analyze the data that are available publicly from the IAEA, it turns out that only the first wave of attacks that started in June 2009 had an impact on the number of centrifuges that were online. At the time, there were 4,920 centrifuges online, if those data are credible, and they dropped significantly by approximately 1,000. The problem is, these numbers have to be put into context, and we cannot attribute the drop exclusively to Stuxnet. I mean, we're making a lot of assumptions if we do that. I cannot go into enough detail to make that point here in the detail you would probably want me to do because of time constraints, but I'd be happy to point you to recent publications that do that. Bottom line is, overall, the Iranian enrichment capability did not significantly dip. And the ability of the Iranians to install new machines, new centrifuges, and to run those new centrifuges did also not dip, but it's continued to climb all the time. So bottom line here is that Stuxnet may have been counterproductive because, thirdly, it improved Iran's defenses. It improved Iran's defenses in a couple of ways because, of course, Iran is now better prepared to deal with similar attacks should they come again. Iran also certainly hardened its systems. We have to assume these people are not stupid. And also, it made it more difficult to gather intelligence on their operation. So, my fourth point, it improved not just Iran's defensive capability when it comes to its nuclear enrichment program, but also Iran's offensive capability. The intelligence communities in different countries assume that Shamoon, the attack against Saudi Aramco, that the attacks against American banks, DDoS attacks, are Iranian operations. We can't prove that, at least on the public domain, the information is not available, but we have to, well-informed people make that assumption. Let's take them by their word. Are you surprised? If you find yourself at the receiving end of the most sophisticated computer attack ever, it's to be expected that you're doing something about defensive and offensive capabilities. So fifthly, my fifth point, Stuxnet set a precedent. Or to put it in a term that's more familiar to Israelis, Stuxnet redefined the rules of the game. It's now okay to do offensive operations on a major scale. And that is, it's rather ironic that the United States and Israel together, and they're claiming publicly credit for the operation, achieved this effect. Now, I want to give the White House some credit here, because last week a secret presidential directive was leaked to the press. It got drowned out by the noise around PRISM, this wiretapping program, or the data mining program. But it's a rather interesting document, because the White House, I think, has understood this problem. The White House states very clearly that if you read the directive, it doesn't talk about Stuxnet explicitly, but I think people have understood that Stuxnet created a number of counterproductive side effects. From an Israeli point of view, let me just add, one of the most unpleasant side effects is that many people outside Israel think that, well, we've done something about the Iranian nuclear program. But really, if you are very concerned about the Iranian nuclear program, and I would be very concerned about this program, then Stuxnet didn't really do that much. It was a feel-good operation in hindsight. Again, it was a good try, but I'm afraid that a kinetic operation may have only been slightly delayed by it, and it may be necessary at some point, but that is not for me to judge. But I just want to make clear, I'm not making this argument from a dovish perspective at all. Okay, let me just briefly mention the defense in a couple of seconds. The point here is that focusing on the offense, focusing on cyber weapons and on cyber war possibly, is weakening the defense. Hyping the offense is weakening the defense. Why? Because, for instance, you attract... The key thing to realize is that investments in the offense, so for instance, Cyber Command and Fort Meade was just announced a couple of months ago, that they would increase their staff 5-fold. Most of those investments at Cyber Command are on the offensive side. That's not fully true, but most of those. Yet, you're not making control systems at home, for instance, or other networks at home, any safer by investing money, by investing personnel and skills on the offensive side. As a result of the hype on the offense, I think it's more difficult for the defense, for the Department of Homeland Security, for ICS CERT and for US CERT to recruit the skilled people that these institutions would need. The offense is just sexier than the defense. So if you're not working for Google, you'd rather work for the NSA, not for the HS. That's a huge problem, I think. What I'm showing you here is just a wake-up call, a graph that should get your attention. This is some of you may be familiar with Shodan, the search engine that collects data on control system devices that are connected to the internet. There's a project that adds geolocation to Shodan, and this is a map they produced. So the dots you can see on this map are control systems. It could be an air conditioning system in a building, although there are not too many of those in Germany. There could be a brewery. This could be anything that's moving stuff around. In other words, some of those may be critical systems, transportation networks, for instance. These shouldn't be, in many cases, shouldn't be connected to the internet, these systems, yet they are. The fact that we don't know how that map looks like, this is an incomplete map, it's not perfect, is to me very, very worrying. And focusing on the offense, or even on active defense, as currently is the discussion, doesn't do anything to make us safer on the defense. So should something serious happen, a serious cyber attack, well, actually people get killed. I think a cyber 9/11 is a very unrealistic scenario, but it is certainly a realistic and thinkable scenario that something bad happens where people actually get hurt and possibly injured. If something like that happens, then, of course, there will be a lot of screaming about cyber war, yes, but a few people will ask, well, did it actually make us any safer to focus on the offense and leave all these systems so badly secured at home? And the answer is, I think it's clear what I'm going to think here, but the answer is didn't do very much. So I'd like to close with that. And if you're interested in my book, I have a few copies on me. It will be out in the US in the fall. It's been published in the UK already. Thank you very much.